Okay, so I think, sir, we are live. Uh,
Okay, sure. Thank you.
yeah, so I think I should formally start uh, and to once again to just to check that how it's going. Yeah. Uh, so I think I should formally thank everyone first, those who have joined in and around the world, watching us live. Uh, this is actually a kind of lecture series, rather, in fact, celebrating uh, Dr. Ambedkar's 135th birth anniversary uh, 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 that is celebrated across the world. So, what in Jadavpur we are doing from the Department of International Relations, I took this initiative in consultation with the head of the department for the first time to commemorate this whole month as Babasaheb Ambedkar month, rather than calling it a probably Dalit History Month, because Dalit History Month is also being celebrated in other places. So I thought of commemorating that. It's a tribute to Baba Sahib. And in part of that, to remember him, I couldn't think of anyone better than Professor Jayaseelan Raj. How can I describe him? He has been a great motivator in my own life, and a big brother, and also somebody who I look up to academically and scholarly. What a gracious academic he is, and he has. I had invited him, and he never said no. He had immediately said that yes, I'll be there, Shubhajit. So, and then I couldn't hold this program anytime better than this in the month when Baba Sahib Ambedkar was born 135 years back. So today we thought of the title of the this webinar is Caste Resistance and Autonomy, Ambedkar's Revolutionary Politics. So, and to formally introduce Dr. Jayaseelan Raj, he's an associate professor right now at King's College London, and of course he's a prolific academic. I mean, those of us are in social sciences, are in sociology, largely humanities, social sciences. I'm sure that you are all aware of the kind of works that he has been doing. He has right now an associate professor in anthropology and international department development at King's College London. And in fact, before joining King's, he was a professor at the Center for Modern Indian Studies, SEMIS of the University of Göttingen, Germany. In previously, he was an assistant professor at the Center for Development Studies, CDS. I'm sure all of you know Trivandrum uh, in India, and a postdoctoral research fellow earlier at the LSE, London School of Economics and Political Science. He is also a fellow in the GRNPP project at the Department of Anthropology, School of Oriental and African Studies, that is SOAS in London, and Professor Raj holds a PhD in social anthropology from the University of Bergen, Norway, and he is very importantly a part of a or associated with the egalitarianism project based in Bergen anthropology. He was recently awarded the New India Foundation Fellowship to write a book on Dalits and state in Kerala. His research areas are quite vast. He works on plantation systems and agrarian change. His seminal work on the plantation crisis was published from University UCL Press in 2022, which is titled as Plantation Crisis, Ruptures of Dalit Life in the Indian Tea Belt. So, in fact, apart from that, he works on social inequality, discrimination, and racial capitalism, identity, citizenship, social movements, anthropology of labor, migration and development, and economic crisis in the global south. Anthropology of State, Violence and Welfare, and importantly, the ethnographic methods in India and South Africa. He has been, in fact, conducting ethnographic research on agrarian and industrial transformation in South India. In fact, his book, Plantation Crisis, Ruptures of Dalit Life in the Indian Tea Belt, which was published in 2022, has been briefed in Nature as one of the best 5 books on violent conservation, as it offers a unique and richly detailed analysis of the profound multidimensional sense of crisis felt by those who are at the bottom of global plantation capitalism and caste hierarchy. He, in fact, co authored a few books. One of them is Ground Down by Growth, Tribe, Caste, Class, and Inequality in 21st Century India, published from Pluto Press in 2017, and then from Oxford University Press in 2018, which was selected as one of the top 10 nonfiction of 2018 by the Hindu of India. And of course, you know that these articles and publications are everywhere in the Journal of Agrarian Change and Critic of Anthropology, and so on. So I think, I mean, there's so much that I can go on. He has been writing almost on the contemporary issues of caste violence, Dr. Ambedkar's politics of counter narrative, and so on. So, in fact, I was reading one of his article that was published in 2022 in titled as "Post-Colonial Caste: Ambedkar and the Politics of Counter Narrative." So, and in fact, fantastic work. So, I mean, and this is something which today's topic is something which probably is going to open up so many avenues and probably problematize the way we think about probably Ambedkar's politics or the revolutionary politics, which is popularized otherwise or maybe unpopularized in and around the world. In fact, there is a lot of talk that has happened in the scholarly spaces in the global academia about that how resistance and autonomy are in fact not part of the caste or the maybe anti-caste assertions, but sort of looking that through the lens of Ambedkar's revolutionary politics is something which is probably going to bring in some fresh perspectives to us. And I think I'm actually looking forward to the lecture, and I wouldn't waste much time. Once again, thank sir that you have very graciously and promptly agreed to my invitation. And thank you so much for agreeing and joining us on this month when we are commemorating Babasaheb Ambedkar's birth anniversary. Thank you, sir.
Thank you so much, Subhajit, for the invitation and for very, very generous introduction. And I'm really, really glad to be here and again speaking and discussing, engaging in conversation on Babasaheb, Dr. Ambedkar in the month of April. So I'd like to talk a little bit on the link between the way Ambedkar think about caste and resistance and in relation to autonomy, and the ways through which we could rethink what we generally consider as Ambedkar's revolutionary politics. That's why I titled it as Caste, Resistance, and Autonomy, Ambedkar's revolutionary politics. So I just want to emphasize and start with the idea of autonomy, which is very central to Ambedkar's thought, in my view, but not quite duly discussed in relation to ideas such as liberty, democracy, social mobility, development, etc. And I would like to emphasize on the notion of autonomy in Ambedkar's thought and why that is so central to understand Ambedkar's politics, and also which offers a lot of way into discussing contemporary discourse around development models, development regimes, development politics, because development is not merely an agenda that everybody decide to pursue, but also there is a political life of development aspirations, development regimes around the world, and particularly that is so case in India. So I would like to touch upon and relate to the sort of linkage between autonomy and the sort of contemporary discourse on development, but also partly in relation to how Ambedkar's thought, Ambedkarite politics is viewed and discussed recently in the context of politics of narrative and counter narrative, as Shubhajit mentioned. So many of us who are interested in Ambedkar's thought, of course, would have noticed recent discussions, debates around the way Ambedkarite politics is criticized as being not paying attention to certain kind of radical politics, not being committed or fully committed to Ambedkar's radical ideas. And often such kind of criticism comes from intellectuals and activists who are seldom associated with Ambedkarite politics in the first place. But there is a sort of politics of positionality, which is also linked to who could discuss Ambedkar in the way we are discussed. We discuss Ambedkarite thought today, but also what is the sort of politics of positionality? Can we talk about politics of positionality in relation to such a debate? So there is, I just want to also touch upon what I would call as categories of Ambedkar's thought. So this is a proposition that I put forward, that um, certain criticism occurs against Ambedkar's um, thought in the way it appeared recently, is mainly because of a lack of understanding of what was Ambedkar's categories, the categories Ambedkar developed in relation to the question of oppression and emancipatory politics. So uh, for Ambedkar, for example, in the sort of recent discussion, um, one specific aspect that is often highlighted is that Ambedkarites often overlooks class politics, or they are not so interested in questions of class-based oppression. They are not so interested in the struggle, economic struggle particularly, and often are accused of um, performing in the sort of realm of cultural rather than just entering into the sort of material, material sort of struggle for struggle for much more egalitarian society in terms of class. So I would just give an example to start with how Ambedkar's categories are distinct from the categories that are used to criticize Ambedkar or Ambedkarites thought. So for me, when Ambedkar discuss idea of class in relation to caste, he doesn't talk about class in the way um, the others in the sort of recent intellectual discussion. Others criticize Ambedkar for, or Ambedkarites who are engaged in anti-caste politics, in the um, who are engaged in anti-caste politics, are accused of overlooking class politics, right? So the point is that the kind of class that Ambedkar talks about is very much encompassed by caste, in my view. So the class, we need to understand what does class means in the context of India, rather than just taking it for granted as a category that emerges from a Western Eurocentric perspective of class. So often, critical scholars focus on the idea of decoloniality, post-colonialism, etc., in criticizing what appears to be Eurocentric views. But when it comes to the sort of criticism they want to place at certain kind of politics, they don't want to question the category itself. Rather, they just take the category for granted. So my proposition is that in order to understand Ambedkar's revolutionary politics, in order to understand what caste meant for Dr. Ambedkar, one needs to pay specific attention to how the kind of categories and concepts that he engaged with are in fact developed by him. And and we should also pay attention to the context in which such ideas develop, and therefore uh, the kind of um, engagement that one, if one want to have proper with Ambedkar's thought, one needs to go back to the categories that he developed, and in the context in which he explains those categories. And so for example, when we understand that the class that Ambedkar talks about is something that is not just related to caste, but very much reformed by caste itself. So class doesn't exist as something like a category outside, or even just as a sort of detached part of caste, but it very much reconstituted by caste, right? So so that is very very much important for us to understand Ambedkar's thought about autonomy. And Ambedkar places questions of liberty, mobility, human emancipation through this notion of social, and the way social encompasses economic and political. That we have, we have read in number of instances where Ambedkar talks about how social democracy is more important than political or economic democracy, or how social reform is very much central, and much a central agenda compared to political and economic reforms. So when we take notion of social as a central aspect in Ambedkar's thought, within which, of course, economic and political are located, we would appreciate the complexity in which he talks about um, human emancipation. So in that context, for Ambedkar, idea of autonomy, in my view, is very central for human emancipation. And autonomy, he approach autonomy not merely in terms of social well-being, or social choice, to borrow from Amartya Sen, but much more as a freedom to live a dignified life, right? So freedom to live a dignified life. And Ambedkar indicates his orientation to the significance of autonomy in a number of texts. But just to point out one important text, which is Buddha or Karl Marx. In Buddha or Karl Marx, when Ambedkar talks, and Ambedkar compares the political philosophy of Buddha and Karl Marx in terms of for emancipatory politics, Ambedkar goes back to not just sort of material struggle as the struggle for humanity, but also Ambedkar talks about larger religious, spiritual struggle in relation to the material struggle. So often it is discussed that material struggle as something opposed to social struggle, or cultural struggle, or spiritual struggle, or larger ideological struggle. But in Ambedkar's thought, these are inseparable components, but but human dignity and the freedom and the autonomy, and the sort of breathing space for a dignified life is very much at the center of Ambedkar's idea of emancipation. So what happens often is that the critique of the critique that Ambedkarite politics often overlooks material struggle doesn't actually pay attention to Ambedkar's these revolutionary political thought, but also that is related to the way contemporary Ambedkarite anti-caste movements, particularly Dalit movements, are viewed and criticized for overlooking certain dimensions of economic struggle. But then the problem lies in the fact that lack of understanding of what is Ambedkarite ideology in terms of human emancipation, autonomy, etc., is also reflected in this sort of very myopic critique, because much of these criticism comes out from thin air, because they don't pay attention to these sort of empirical realities in India, where much of the contemporary struggle for land, for higher wages, for better working conditions comes actually from autonomous movements, who are not so much linked to organized organized left politics or other kinds of politics in India. So it's very important to understand both the categories and the sort of empirical grounded realities in order to appreciate both Ambedkarite thoughts and the kind of politics that comes out of it. And what happens and why then there is so much reception to the sort of flimsy criticism against Ambedkarite politics in the contemporary Indian society is because what I would call as the sort of sort of course, the intellectual hegemony of upper caste, not only within Indian academia but also beyond globally. So, for example, the article that Subhajit mentioned earlier on which appeared in History and Anthropology, where I talk about post-colonial sort of politics of caste, intellectual history of the way post-colonialism appropriate caste question and the problems with that. I explain also through the question of positionality, by which the scholars based in India and abroad, mostly from very privileged upper caste backgrounds, appropriate Ambedkar by talking about caste, but perhaps they won't talk about Dalits. But sometimes they talk about Dalits, but don't talk about caste. Sometimes they talk about both, but they don't talk about anti-caste from the perspective of Dalit communities. And so that's sort of a privileged positionality, which is not often talked about, is very central to the way these sort of flimsy criticisms are received widely. And often the problem is that in academics as well as beyond academics, much of these sort of debates are set by the sort of mainstream intellectual circle. Of course, there is huge opposition to that, and but still, the attempt is to control that sort of central dominant intellectual position space within which one could easily make flimsy criticisms against Ambedkarite politics without duly engaging with what really they are today. And this is something one could call as the way Brahminical imagination that controls that attempt to controls what and how Dalit politics should be, including by saying that, oh, Dalits should be very much go back to Ambedkar, while most of the uh, Ambedkarite politics are very much highly committed to that, but that's not seen. So there is, even when there is a huge paradox in that sort of assertions. They are not um, properly duly subjected for criticism is because of the sort of politics of positionality, and how often the upper caste intellectual circle appropriate and accumulate power is by playing this sort of similar I mean, so these upper caste intellectual circle accumulate power by playing politics of positionality outside India, mainly by claiming that they are from global south and they were very much for a sort of a post-colonial, decolonial, critical intellectual politics, but often they are very much silent in explaining their own positions and positionality when it comes to discussions at the level when it comes to the question of caste, for example. Um, Having said that, I would just also connect it a little bit to the contemporary discourses around the question of development, because I'm an anthropologist, also works on the issues related to development. So what is often not acknowledged is that the sort of Ambedkar's thought on autonomy has been very central to welfare economics, for example, of Amartya Sen and others. And although Amartya Sen has acknowledged Ambedkar in a couple of times, but I'm not sure that Sen or others have properly engaged in understanding these sort of multidimensional aspects of Ambedkar's stress on autonomy in explaining the theories related to social well-being, social choice, etc. So often, those sort of ideas remain very much as economic, although it comes from the complexities of social that is emphasized by Ambedkar, and uh, to continue with the sort of overlooking of Ambedkar's political and social thought, particularly in relation to autonomy. Much of the discussions around development models, particularly from the regions that I come from, Kerala and Tamil Nadu, often that sort of approach is not appreciated. So, of course, it comes from critical radical political economy, but often that overlooks the importance of the linkage between caste and development politics that is played out in India. So what happens in those development models and claims, development claims, that Dalits are often produced as outliers, both within the discourse and within the sort of subnationalistic claim of competing narrative uh, of different development models to point out two such development models which are very much subnationalist in tendencies, are Kerala and Tamil Nadu. And of course, Gujarat model is there, hugely problematic. But I'm not an expert on that to comment here. But I just work on Kerala and Tamil Nadu, so I will just focus on it here. Where you would, in both Kerala and Tamil Nadu, the whole discussions around social justice, anti-caste politics, and development model occur in such a way that those sort of discourses keep Dalits as outliers, but they would try to incorporate uh, part of Dalit life into certain claims on education, particularly. But I'm not talking about numbers here, but I just want to focus on the sort of discourse that is generated by mostly upper caste, non-Dalit intellectuals, which contributes, reinforces the popular sense or popular regime of social justice, which is so much detached from the sort of grounded realities of violence, oppression, and marginality of Dalit communities. So what happens in with these sort of development models when Dalits are only incorporated as outliers, when caste question is not so taken seriously, it not only leads to sort of overlooking of the marginality and the violence that is produced in this context, but also they reinforces and rationalizes that that sort of violence, because um, the development models or the discourse around that occurs through the ideological framing of social justice and equality. So you can have different kinds of development models, but what happens when you particularly talking about development models which you frame it in within the context of social justice, particularly in the case of Tamil Nadu, or uh, relative egalitarianism as in Kerala, what happens is that you also rationalize that marginality and violence. So how that so the point is that even development models, development critique, which would appears to be progressive compared to mainstream neoclassical economic thought, they don't truly appreciate both the significance of bringing in the late marginality, but also they underplay the significance of thinking about what should be the development model, what should be the sort of development orientation in the context of India. So for that, we need to again go back to Ambedkar, who makes very interesting linkage between the ideological and material more than any other political philosopher that I know. So I will stop here, and we'll probably take questions or comments.
Okay. Uh, I think uh, since uh, there is little scope of taking questions because it's a closed one, but I thank you, sir, uh, for that wonderful glimpse into this silent, what I felt is silent positionality of upper caste, from the positions of privilege on issues of caste and Dalits. The positionality on caste from the positions of upper caste at times are silent on Dalits and sometimes on Dalits, but they're silent on caste, and sometimes they talk both, which I found very, very intriguing and thought-provoking that the way the upper caste academy organize themselves in and around the discussion of caste while being silent on the anti-caste. In fact, Professor Amartya Sen has written a whole 50 pages, 60 pages, or rather, it's technically 60 pages, but 50 pages paper in Asian Development Bank, the social development papers, which was actually on the website of Asian Development Bank, Office of Environment Social Development, where he was a professor at Trinity then, and of course, a professor emerita in Harvard. His title was Social Exclusion Concept Application and Scrutiny, where he talks a lot about racial exclusionary practices and all that, but of course, silence is scarce. So, again, the silent positionality is something which I felt probably something very intriguing. But I think I was checking the YouTube live sort of stream where I thought, or live chat, if there is any question. I saw Bhupendra is thanking all of us to for this thought-provoking thing, but otherwise, I haven't found any question being asked there. Uh, but I think, sir, I just will ask a question, will not take much time of yours, and then we can wrap up, or maybe with your final thoughts. where again you have very briefly talked about the politics of counter narrative, and but again it's a paper that I'm reading and rereading, the 2000 the paper that I have written for history and anthropology, published in 2022, where this paper is trying to sort of advance Dalit centric historical anthropology of caste, and basically trying to focus on the relationship, the competing rather relationship, the competing discourses on the histories of caste. How, in that case, you probably look at the this whole, Dalit centric historical anthropology of caste in the probably in the time of silent positionality of the upper caste academicians in global academia. Probably if you can shed some lights there or your thoughts.
Yeah. Um, yeah, I'm glad you picked up on the silent positionality. So I'll just briefly respond to that, then comes to your question on this. So Ambedkar, Amartya Sen has mentioned a couple of times in public lecture that Ambedkar was so important for his thought. But if you actually go back and look at the sort of academic text, it doesn't appear so. So this is also very much consistent that with very much that you see from the upper caste privileged intellectual, where in this sort of political scene, they would try to appreciate Ambedkar, but when it comes to taking Ambedkar's thought um, seriously within their own text as academic, you don't find it, right? So that is there. Um, and secondly, Amartya Sen's thought is very much inspired by John Dewey, who was the teacher of Ambedkar. So there is a clear connection. So even if you want to look at the sort of idea of justice, liberty, mobility, social welfare, well-being in the context and public choice, you could also rethink in terms of autonomy and capability. One could also think in relation to autonomy. And there is no political philosopher comparable to Ambedkar in India who has discussed these ideas before Sen. So Sen being an economist, but also interested in political philosophy, social theory, etc. It's so strange that we don't find proper engagement, rather just a couple of brief acknowledgement. That's a problem. So on the second question on historical anthropology of caste in relation to the contemporary intellectual politics, positionality. So one example I discuss in the paper is about how certain kind of discourses around the history of caste appears to be as a discussion between white scholars and upper caste Indians. So this has been the sort of dominant thing, right? So you would see in subaltern politics, subaltern historiography versus Cambridge historiography, or on the discussion on politics of caste, you would find people taking positions. And when we say people, only you find um, Western scholars like Euro-American, who are based in Euro-American universities, or upper caste, mostly Brahmin scholars, who are either based in top universities in India or abroad. But then what we see is that mostly the engagement from non-upper caste intellectual circle is seen as something like a side stream that could happen somewhere, right? But even when we see who engaged from a very Dalit centric and a caste perspective, for example, in these debates, you often find also non-Dalits who are very much sympathetic to Dalit cause, who have lived a life committed to Dalit cause, like Gail Womberth. So you would if you go back to the EPW late 80s, early 90s issues, you do find these sort of debates where it mostly upper caste and European scholars, Euro-American scholars. Now, the one thing that I mentioned in the article is on the point of caste and race comparison, which Ambedkar discussed in his 1916 article and the lecture that he gave in Columbia on the mechanism and genesis, and where he criticized, of course, the questions, those who claims caste as race, right? But this has a context. So as I mentioned earlier, one should read things in context. But what happens when it comes to Durban conference, where the Ambedkarite and caste scholars appealed for considering caste as a category which needs to be considered in par with racial discrimination, oppositions came from very dominant group of sociologists in India who said caste is not caste cannot be considered as a racial thing. But on the other context, so whenever there is appeal to consider to discuss caste in the sort of international scene, they would claim that, well, caste is similar to race. Everywhere we have inequality, and in India, caste, you have something else. So caste is not so specific. So we are not talking about political leaders, politicians making their defense strong by these sort of arguments, but we are talking about very much well-known intellectuals and sociologists, anthropologists in India and abroad. In the sort of contemporary discussion, um, race discussion on race is also transformed into something called discussions on racial capitalism, uh, where 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 there are set of scholars who are also interested in talking about caste and capitalism. I'm also talking about caste, capitalism, and development, etc. But the problem is that often caste is captured as an element within racial capitalism rather than talking about the full potential, sort of potency of caste as something that could be taught distinct from racial capitalism. So the problem is that we would just assume category and replace it with caste, which is not what Ambedkar did. Right. So going back to my point on Ambedkar's development, the way he developed categories, one should pay attention to the sort of specific formulations in appreciating its complexities rather than just replacing race with caste. Yeah.
I think we can take one last question from Bhupendra, has asked in the live chat, sir, with your permission, where he's saying, I'm just wondering, how do you see most of the economic theories of caste tending to treat it as an empirical issue and not centering caste as a theory of economic analysis? That's the question that Bhupendra had.
Okay. Yeah.
Yeah.
I think that's a very important question. And it touches upon what I mentioned earlier as understanding the potency of caste. So caste is not merely an identity; it is an ideological system for Ambedkar. And because caste touches everything, right? Ambedkar talks about how caste touches everything and transforms everything it touches upon. And the way caste, the problem with reducing caste to identity is that it becomes it is understood as a sort of a cultural element. That's something that is all about discrimination or untouchability. So that is another problem, is that when some of the people who talk about caste as an empirical issue, they just think that it is about discrimination and untouchability. They don't understand it as a value system that also have a system of organizing economy, right? So I think that's a very serious issue, and it's a very, very important question where one should take caste as a sort of ideological encompassing system and to study anything which appears to be non not so related to caste, one should look at its relation to caste. That's what we should do. So rather than just saying, okay, Dalits, now we talk about caste, you talk about agriculture. How do we talk about caste in agrarian relationships? How do we talk about caste in something, I don't know, maybe monetary policy? I don't know. Maybe something that is not seen as directly linked to caste. But I think that's a very important question and important agenda to think about.
Yeah. Okay. So I think there have been, I once again thank you for delivering this lecture. I think it's better that it will remain on the YouTube. People can always go back and just listen to the whole lecture. Um, and of course, the concluding part of the Q&A. But I think I won't take time. It's a couple of thought-provoking flagging that has been done by you. So which I probably would generate some sort of discussion again on the silent positionality probably, and the probably silencing some sort of positionality from the privileged sort of locations of the upper caste academia. So I think I wouldn't but extend it anymore. And once again, thank you for giving us time and sparing some time from your schedule, rather, because you have been moving from of course from London to US and then coming back and delivering lectures. But again, you have very kindly agreed, sir, for being with us today. Uh, I thank you on behalf of the department and on behalf of me for just delivering the lecture. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you, Subhajit, for the invitation again. Thank you so much.
Yes, thank you. Suppose we can end. Huh? Okay. So can I exit? Huh? Or should I wait? Hmm. Exit করে যাই? Okay, thank you.